Course 3, Lesson 33, we are looking at subtracting integers. But what we're really going to be doing is taking these subtraction problems and turning them into addition problems. So if we look at our first example, we say, Haley owed $200 on her credit card, and she made another purchase for 20 bucks. How much does she now owe? Well, normally we would set this up and say we have negative 200, and then we're taking away another 20. Well, we can actually change this into an addition problem so that we can look at those addition rules rather than trying to remember how to subtract. So what we can do is say we have this process where we basically do two different inverse operations. Say we leave the first number alone, we leave it as negative 200. We change the minus sign to a plus, that's our first inverse operation. And then we're using the opposite of the second number, so that's our second inverse operation. And so by doing two inverse operations, we keep the actual problem the same, but make it a little bit easier to use our addition rules and say, okay, we have the same sign here, so we add up the numbers 200 plus 20 and get 220 and keep the minus sign. We call this adding the opposite. It's really the same, it's just two different ways to think about it. So if we look at something like this, we can use our 3 steps and say we keep the first number 30, we change the subtraction to an addition, and change negative 5 to its opposite, 5. So we get 35. Often, or whenever you see this minusing a negative, that really just becomes a positive. Minusing a negative is the same thing as adding. So let's change a couple of these. We have negative 12 minus 15. Well, that's the same as negative 12 plus a negative 15. We can just add up those numbers to 27 and keep the subtraction or the negative sign. And then we could do 10 plus 90 and get 100. 25 minus 34, well, that we can add a negative 34 and say, okay, 34 minus 25, remember, same signs, add and keep. Different signs, we subtract and keep the sign of the greater absolute value. So we do 34 minus 25 is 9, and the greater absolute value is the negative 34, so it's a negative 9. And then, lastly, negative 100 plus a negative 37 is a negative 137. So adding the opposite. Next, you could think about it on a number line as well. So if we have negative 5 minus a negative 2, so we first start at our negative 5, and then we think of the minus sign as meaning to do the opposite of the second number. Well, the opposite of the second number is 2, so we're going to go forward 2. All right, so we get negative 3. And this is just fine to do with a lot of things. So we can start at negative 8 and minusing a negative 9. Well, that's just adding 9, so we go all the way back to 1. Okay, so try some of these. We'll just do these and then do a little bit more challenging ones. So negative 6 minus 7, that's the same as negative 6 plus a negative 7. So we get a negative 13. 7 minus 15, well, that's really 7 plus a negative 15. So we subtract those two numbers and get 8, and it's going to be a negative 8 since the negative 15 is a greater absolute value. Negative 8 minus a negative 3, well, that's just negative 8 plus 3. We subtract the numbers and get 5 and keep the negative sign. And lastly, 10 plus 18 is going to give us 28. Now, what happens if we're now dealing with 3 numbers that we're subtracting? Well, let's go piece by piece and say, let's turn this all into addition. We have negative 8, well, minus 5 could be turned into adding a negative 5. And then we're subtracting a negative 11, well, that's adding a positive 11. So we go left to right and say negative 8 plus a negative 5 is a negative 13, plus 11 is a negative 2. So it's kind of nice because then we just have to remember our rules for addition and not have to think about, okay, the subtraction means go the other way, but what if I have a negative number? What does that tell me? Well, let's turn this all into addition. We have negative 14 plus 4 plus a negative 12, and going left to right we have negative 10 plus a negative 12 is a negative 22. All right. Lots of different examples of these, but let's look at some word problems. And say, at 5 a.m. this morning in Nova Scotia, the temperature was negative 12 degrees Celsius, and by 8 a.m. the temperature increased by 3 degrees. What's the temperature at 8 a.m.? Well, we have negative 12 and then we increased by 3, meaning we got to negative 9 degrees Celsius. That's what we should get under our snowman. And the core temperature of my turkey was negative 6 degrees Celsius. After I put it into the coldest region of my freezer, it decreased another 7 degrees. Now what's the temperature? Well, I started at negative 6 and then I took away another 7. Well, that's the same as taking negative 6 plus a negative 7, which means that we get a negative 13 degrees Celsius. That's cold. All right, some practice problems if you would like to try them. Okay, try them out and then look at those answers. And lastly, a couple more story problems that you can try. Just make sure that you put your subtraction in the right place. So Billy has a checking balance of $12.86, and in the mail he receives a rebate check for $25 and a bill for $128. So we would say, okay, we start with $12.86, and that rebate is a good thing. We add 25, but the bill we are subtracting $128. Well, we can turn this into an addition problem, $12.86 plus 25 plus a negative 128, so that we can just add those together and get his current balance. Well, I hope this was helpful for your homework and for studying.